They told you it was about justice. They told you it was about narcotics. They told you it was about restoring democracy to a troubled nation. They lied to you. What just happened in Venezuela is not a police action. It is not a diplomatic maneuver. It is the largest corporate acquisition of the 21st century, executed at the barrel of a gun. To understand why the United States government just shattered every norm of international law to seize a sitting head of state, you do not need to look at a law book. You need to look at a single number that is flashing red in the basement of the US Treasury. 395 million. That is the current level of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR. It is the emergency heartbeat of the American economy. And right now, that heartbeat is fading. It is at its lowest level in over 40 years. If a major war broke out tomorrow in the Middle East, the United States would be vulnerable in a way it has not been since the 1970s. In his inauguration address, President Trump made a promise that went unnoticed by the mainstream media, but sent shockwaves through the energy markets. He promised to fill the reserve. He promised to bring energy prices down to rock bottom. But there was a problem. American shale oil cannot fill that reserve alone. The geology does not work. The physics do not work. They needed a specific type of oil, and they needed billions of barrels of it immediately. They looked at the map, and they saw only one solution. A solution that required removing the man standing at the gate. This is not a story about human rights. This is a story about the world's largest gas station and the hostile takeover that just handed the keys to Washington. Welcome to the resource war of 2025. The technical truth why shale was not enough. To understand this crisis, you have to understand the dirty secret of American energy independence. For the last decade, politicians have told you that the U.S. is the world's #1 oil producer. That is true. But it is a truth that hides a fatal flaw. The oil that comes out of the ground in Texas and North Dakota is what the industry calls light, sweet crude. It is thin. It is clean. It flows like water. But the massive refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast, the industrial cathedrals that power the American economy, were not built for this. They were built in the 1990s and 2000s to process heavy sour crude. Think of it like sludge, thick, sulfurous, and difficult to refine. You cannot run a heavy refinery on light oil efficiently. It is like trying to run a diesel truck on high-octane racing fuel. It destroys the engine. For years, the United States solved this engineering problem by importing heavy sludge from two places, the Middle East and Venezuela. But look at the world today. The Middle East is on fire. The Strait of Hormuz is one missile strike away from closure. Relying on Saudi Arabia is no longer a safety net. It is a liability. That leaves only one option: Venezuela. Beneath the soil of the Orinoco Belt lies the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, and crucially, it is exactly the type of heavy sour crude that American refineries are starving for. Transporting oil from the Persian Gulf takes 45 days. Transporting oil from Venezuela takes 4 days. From a strategic standpoint, Venezuela is not a foreign country. It is a southern extension of the U.S. energy grid that happens to have the wrong flag. For the last few years, the U.S. tried sanctions. They tried to starve the regime out. It did not work. It only pushed Maduro closer to Beijing and Moscow. With the SPR drained and global war looming, the time for patience ran out. The United States could no longer afford to ask nicely for the oil it needs to survive. So they went in and took management. The dragon's wallet, decoding China's rage. The reaction from the other side of the world was immediate, and it was furious. You have heard the clips of the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson. They used words like grave concern and violation of international norms. In the world of diplomatic speak, these are not just complaints. They are threats. But why is China so angry? Is it because they care deeply about the sanctity of Venezuelan law? No. China is angry because they just witnessed a bank robbery, and they are the bank. For the last 15 years, Beijing has played a long game in Caracas. They call it the Belt and Road Initiative. But in Venezuela, it was a simple transaction: loans for oil. China loaned Venezuela over $60 billion to build infrastructure, dams, and refineries. Venezuela did not pay back in cash. They paid back in barrels of oil. This was the perfect symbiotic relationship. China, the world's factory, needs endless energy. Venezuela needed cash. But the deal relied on one critical assumption: that the government in Caracas would honor the contract. By physically removing Nicolas Maduro, the United States has effectively voided those contracts. When the Chinese spokesperson mentioned protecting China's legitimate interests, they were not talking about philosophy. They were talking about solvency. Current estimates suggest Venezuela still owes Chinese entities between $10 and $12 billion. But the real number, including joint ventures and infrastructure projects, could be close to $100 billion in sunk costs. If a US-installed interim government takes power, their first move will be obvious. They will declare the Chinese loans odious debt. They will argue that the money was lent to a corrupt dictator, not the people, and therefore they do not have to pay it back. China knows this playbook because the West has used it before. This is why Beijing is panicking. They are looking at a scenario where their strategic foothold in Latin America is wiped out overnight. Their assets will be auctioned off to ExxonMobil and Chevron. Their oil shipments will be diverted to Houston, and their geopolitical influence in America's backyard will evaporate. The transcript of the Chinese response links this event to Taiwan and Iran for a reason. They are telling Washington that if you break the rules here, we will break the rules there. If you can seize our assets in Venezuela, what stops us from seizing your assets in the South China Sea? The dragon is not just breathing fire because it is angry. It is breathing fire because it has just been mugged. The hidden war, Petrodollar versus petroleum. But there is a deeper layer to this onion. A layer that explains why the US acted now with such extreme prejudice. It wasn't just about getting the oil. It was about how that oil is paid for. Since the 1970s, the global economy has run on a simple agreement. If you want to buy oil anywhere in the world, you must buy it in US dollars. This is the petrodollar system. It is the source of America's true power. It creates an artificial demand for the dollar, allowing the US to print money and run deficits without collapsing its economy. Maduro was a threat to this system, not because he was a socialist, but because he was a separatist. For years, Venezuela has been trying to sell its oil in Chinese yuan. Just months before his arrest, discussions were accelerating about creating a Yuan Oil Hub in the Caribbean, supported by Russian logistics and Chinese banking. Imagine a world where the largest oil reserves on Earth are traded in the currency of America's greatest rival. That is an existential threat to the US Treasury. If the world stops needing dollars to buy oil, the value of the dollar collapses. Inflation in the US would not be 3% or 5%. It would be 50%. By arresting Maduro, the US has sent a mafia-style message to the rest of OPEC, to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, to Iraq. The message is clear. You can torture dissidents. You can start wars. You can starve your people. But the moment you try to sell your oil in a currency other than the US dollar, you will be removed. This operation was a defense of the dollar, disguised as a defense of democracy. Legally, the US justified this by stripping Maduro of his sovereign immunity. They claimed he was not the legitimate president, therefore he had no diplomatic protection. This is a legal fiction, but a powerful one. It essentially creates a law of the jungle. It tells the world that sovereign immunity only applies to leaders the United States likes. If you are on the wrong side of Washington, you are not a head of state. You are a fugitive. This sets a precedent that will tear the fabric of international relations apart. The fallout, a world without rules. So what happens next? The United States has secured the oil, but at what cost? We are entering a period of asymmetric retaliation. China is smart. They will not send battleships to the Caribbean to fight the US Navy. That is a losing game. Instead, they will weaponize the global supply chain. If the US takes Venezuela's oil, China may tighten the noose on rare earth minerals. These are the essential components for F-35 fighter jets, electric vehicle batteries, and advanced guidance systems. China controls 90% of the processing capacity for these minerals. You take our oil, we take your microchips. We take your ability to build the weapons you use to threaten us. Then there is the debt weapon. China holds over $700 billion in US Treasury bonds. If they decide to dump these bonds on the open market, it would cause interest rates in the US to spike uncontrollably. It would crash the US housing market and send the stock market into a tailspin. It is the economic equivalent of a nuclear option. And then there is Russia and Iran. They are watching Venezuela closely. They see that the US military is stretched thin. They see a new opportunity to turn Venezuela into a quagmire. They will likely flood the country with portable anti-aircraft missiles, drones, and advisors. Their goal will be to ensure that the US never gets that oil out of the ground cheaply. They will fund guerrilla groups to blow up pipelines and attack tankers. They will turn the Orinoco Belt into a burning graveyard of American investment. The US wanted a cheap gas station. They might have just bought themselves a 20-year insurgency, the price of hegemony. As we wrap up, we have to look at the scoreboard. In the short term, the United States has won. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve will likely be refilled with heavy Venezuelan crude. Gas prices at the pump might drop before the next midterm election. The petrodollar lives to fight another day, but the long-term cost is incalculable. By kidnapping a head of state, the United States has announced the death of the international order it built after World War II. We have returned to an era of empires, an era where might makes right, an era where resources are not bought and sold, but seized and defended. The mask has fallen off. The world sees the American empire not as a policeman, but as a predator that is running out of food. China sees it, Russia sees it, and the global south sees it. The arrest of Nicolas Maduro was the opening shot of the resource wars of 2025. It proved that when an empire is desperate for energy, laws are just suggestions. The only question left is simple. If the US is willing to burn down the rules of diplomacy to save its economy, what will its rivals burn down to stop them? This is just the beginning of the financial counterattack. If you think the war for oil is brutal, wait until you see the war for debt. In our next video, we are going to expose China's nuclear debt option and exactly how Beijing plans to make Washington pay for this seizure. You cannot afford to miss that analysis. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because in this new world, ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is bankruptcy. I'll see you in the next report.